Thank you for the introduction, Tom. And I think I'm the last speaker from DIT London today, so I would like to thank you on behalf of us all for assembling such a distinguished audience. It's fabulous. And just talking to people in the break, there's clearly a lot of good things already happening, so good on you and your team. Well done. And also, I suppose I should also thank you for the dinner last night. Susan and I went off to a traditional Japanese pub with some of the other speakers last night and enjoyed some good Japanese beer, excellent Japanese beer and food. So thank you for that too. You're clearly enjoying your time in Tokyo. I'm just going to spend a few minutes explaining a little bit about the work we do in the field of property regeneration within Susan's team at the Department of International Trade. I guess I should start by probably attempting to define regeneration, because it's a word that has come out of the world of policy and politics. I'm not sure it necessarily travels as well as we'd hoped it might, but what we are essentially talking about is non-core real estate that sits most naturally in the fund management environment in the alternative asset space. It sometimes embraces urban renewal. It sometimes involves government participation, but not always. But what it always attempts to do, and at its best succeeds in doing, is drawing together some of the things we've been talking about throughout the afternoon in terms of capitalising on infrastructure improvements, ensuring that innovation in energy, in education, and other areas are actually harnessed for the benefit of the communities of, in our case, the United Kingdom. The UK has always had a reputation for chaperoning inward investment into our small little island stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic. Much of it has come from Japan. What we've been less obviously known for until David Cameron initiated the opportunity some 4 or 5 years ago was making it easy for capital to be transmissioned into projects. And that's what fundamentally we do. We work with investors, large aggregators of capital, to attempt to de-risk the process of deploying capital in the United Kingdom, but to align it where possible with some of the big policy areas that are important to our government and designed for the benefit of our population. Let's see if I can get this right. Our offer to investors, well, it varies. I mean, it's designed as a tailored situation. But ideally, what we have done as a prelude to talking to you here today, or any other investors who are visiting the UK or interested in deploying capital there, is to have identified projects of an investable grade that meet certain criteria, and where there is the potential for partnerships to help broker those. Typically, they occur in established cities. We do some work in London, so I'll talk about 1 or 2 of those in a moment, but primarily with a view to capitalising on the 500 billion, I think it is, Piers is not here, I can't check with him, of infrastructure projects that have been brought forward around the country. We also, this is immensely significant, as an outsider, I'm not a civil servant, I joined Susan's team about 3 years ago. I'm absolutely staggered by the effort our politicians put in to supporting people, the way they stand by them and actually make life easier in terms of those inevitable things that come up when you're dealing with the complex projects that people in this room typically are. The type of investors we work with, well, I mean, there is no limit to the categorisation, but fundamentally we are working with big institutions, insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. I mean, examples are Legal & General, who we have a joint fund with that's so far deployed about 2 billion into UK cities. We work very closely with Australian Super. We work with the Malaysian Employment Provident Fund. We work very closely with some of the large sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf. No real limit to it. What we also do is partner those people with localised expertise. One of the best examples, and I think that someone from Mitsui here today, is the relationship they have with one of our large developers, Stanhope, which has resulted in, amongst other things, the redevelopment of the BBC headquarters out in White City. There is a fundamental change in the way our development community has operated over the past 10 to 15 years. They were a very closed grouping historically, not resistant to capital, but not comfortable with deploying it. They classically went to the banks in times when you could and highly leveraged their schemes. That is no longer the case. There is not a single major project now occurring throughout the United Kingdom that hasn't got somewhere within the capital stack foreign capital from somewhere or another. Investor credentials, well, again, not to over-define things, but classically, of course, we want to work with people who are taking a long-term view. Typically, they're organisations who are looking to match long-dated cash flows with long-dated obligations in terms of their pension commitments going forward, but not uniquely so. We work with family office, we work with high net worth individuals, we work with established trading companies, anyone at all who has a policy of investing offshore and in what we define as real assets. Although we say typically investment horizon, unlike some of the infrastructure periods you've been hearing about, of 3 to 5 years, some of these are scheduled to, certainly in those that fall into fund environments, to run for 15 to 20 years. It entirely depends on investor criteria. That gives you some idea. I mean, Susan's team, we've tended today, because of the nature of the audience, to talk about the rather big ticket things, but we embrace the entire spectrum of investor appetite. Classically, people on the left-hand side of the graph will be highly partnered or going into funds. As we move towards the major sovereign pension long-term players, we're looking for limited partnerships involving just 2 or 3 players in our market. But it depends. It's tailored entirely to the needs of the investing organisations. What constitutes a regeneration project? Well, the Pink Floyd fans among you will recognise that structure from the front cover of the Animals long player. But we typically look for projects in the range of 100 to 500 million. And the reason for that is simple, that that's the sort of size we judge that major institutions are comfortable managing. Smaller than that gives a problem in terms of the deployment of funds unless it's part of a portfolio acquisition. Site details, well, again, with a view to de-risking entry to the UK for first-timers, we make a great deal of research to ensure that the land that the scheme depends on is in the beneficial ownership of the promoting party, that it enjoys either planning consent or is being considered in a benign planning environment where the likelihood of consents being forthcoming in reasonable periods of time and thereby reducing costs take place. But we also, while we can't validate a project in terms of its returns, we ensure that the appraisals have been properly undertaken and the business case is robust. In that sort of general area now, we have got around the country in the region of 80 to 90 projects of various styles and types that are available for consideration by overseas investors and within the domestic market as well. I mean, you should be telling me this, but the judgment we've made based on the experience of certainly the last 3 years is the investment biosphere has changed quite significantly. That people are now recognising that in certain category areas, out with the cash flow licenses that come with infrastructure, there are opportunities for steady, solid, supported returns that with the benefit of government endorsement or involvement, or alternatively, public sector land being put in as part of the capital stack, the schemes can be de-risked to provide steady, reliable returns. It's been particularly noticeable with the appetite we've seen from Australia. It's now starting to emerge here to a greater extent than was the case before. My dealings with Japanese investors until this point of time have been largely predicated on buying prime in London. People we have spoken to in the last 6 to 9 months indicate that people are prepared to go up the risk curve where government support is available. And within the allocation process that goes on typically at this time of the year, it looks as though a greater proportion of the allocations now are being directed towards alternatives as opposed to core and prime. But we'll see what the new year brings. I mean, I've said participating in government support, we've got a budget coming up, so I can't make predictions in terms of what's going to happen. But all the mood music would indicate that the environment will improve still further in terms of either fiscal arrangements or alternatively enlargement of some of the planning changes that have been made to allow investment, particularly in the housing sector, to take place. And I'll come to that in a moment. I can't credibly stand before you and say all is rosy back home. Those of you who follow the UK media, I'm sure, will think there are periods when, as a nation, we've gone barking mad. I assure you that that's not the case, although there are things to be addressed. But one thing I would challenge is the notion that we are dealing with unparalleled periods of uncertainty. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I've mentioned infrastructure. I'll now very quickly walk you through some statistics that deal with the fundamentals of what are going on in the economy before perhaps finishing off on a view on Brexit. Don't skin me alive, Susan. It's very much a personal view rather than a government view. HS2, that map's appeared about 4 times today. I promise you there's more to the UK than a railway system. But HS2 is about much more than a railway. It's been designed primarily to reshape the economic geography of the United Kingdom. So much of our history has been predicated on London's strength as a financial centre, despite the fact that historically a great many of our industrial innovations took place in other parts of the country. HS2 is designed to start to correct that process, and government policy more generally, both in terms of education, training and so on, is following scope. We heard about the tendering of the rolling stock. Well, equally, we're now at the stage where 3 major consortiums have been listed and will be announced, I think, in January for the construction of the nodal station at Euston, a project that will probably have a GDV in excess of 1.5 billion, but that's where HS2 will start, and investor interest is already being sought. Next, and often overlooked, I mean, London has always been a fabulous city. I mean, you know, from historic times, it's been important within the world, but it really took off as a global powerhouse about 20 years ago. And coincidentally, or otherwise, I don't believe it's coincidence, that corresponded with the election of a mayor to whom a great deal of power was devolved. A mayor who could deal with businesses, a mayor who could introduce things like, I know it sounds passé, the Oyster card, the cycling schemes in London, a much more benign planning environment that allowed people to get on with what they wanted to do. What has happened, I mean, very quietly actually, you don't hear too much about it, is comparable arrangements have been concluded with so far 6 of our major conurbations. You'll see names up there like Liverpool and Manchester, but it's not about Liverpool and Manchester. It's about the greater area in which those cities sit. So creating critical mass, which for an investor is absolutely crucial in terms of catchment areas, punching power, and more particularly, and this really makes a difference, a single person who you know you need to do business with, and whose sole purpose for having been elected into that job is the economic welfare of the population of the area he's charged with. Manchester's got a mayor now, but it's had one de facto for the best part of the last 15 years in the form of the chief executive there, who behaved and perhaps thought he was a bit godlike, but he got a great deal done. We're seeing the same happening in the Midlands now with Andy Street, the former chief executive of the John Lewis Partnership, taking up the mayoral position, a senior business figure in Bristol in the West Country, and likewise in the Tees Valley in the north. These are all places that are going to benefit from a greater control over their economic and financial affairs that they've been able to enjoy to this point in time. Population growth. The UK is the fastest growing economy in Europe in terms of the population that will create the demand within it. What does that mean? Well, a greater number of consumers, a greater number of homes to be required, a great number of workplaces to be built, a greater or enlarged logistics chain to service that population. And the figures are quite staggering if you look at the nature of the growth. This is not, end of the next century forecast. This is quite imminent, significant changes, far greater that's occurring in any other part of the mainland of Europe. One area where as a nation we failed miserably is in housing provision. And it does date back to the Thatcher period and the home owning democracy, which achieved a great deal of good, but it did result in the balance of tenures not being available and the volume of homes not being available. We're undersupplied by in the region of 150,000 homes per year, and that's cumulative. We've probably got a backlog in the region of 300,000. Looking forward and relating it to population forecast, there is a massive opportunity as institutionalised rented housing becomes available. In the United States, what they call multifamily, I think, represents in the region of 60% of the total real estate stock. In the United Kingdom, it's sub 1%, albeit the assets are now being created at quite a pace. I would anticipate if we're going to become comparable to the more advanced housing markets in Western Europe, that will go up to between 15 and 18% within the next 10 years. It's a massive opportunity for large capital who are looking for the patient cash flows I talked about earlier. Well, I said I'd get to it. I clearly do not know what is going to happen on Brexit. What I do know is, if a hen doesn't lay an egg in the UK right now, in some ways attributable to Brexit. It has had implications. It is undoubtedly causing concerns, particularly in cities that are dependent on the financial markets, but nothing like the scale that is being continually pushed forward. One of the issues, of course, is we've got a government that is having to negotiate in public. It's a very hard thing to do. The reality, in fairness, if you take the City of London, is even if the Eurobond traders were to leave and go to Frankfurt or Dublin or Luxembourg or wherever, we are talking about not too much more than 7,000 jobs. 7,000 important jobs. The reality of that is, sticking with London for a moment, is the majority of demand for space in the square mile, the old historic financial quarter, is now being taken up by creative media and technology firms. The influence of the financial sector, important as it is to our economy, is having less impact on the real estate leasing market in London than was first thought. It may change, but it's not as dramatic as one would have thought. Central London leasing figures are robust. We've retained our number one position at the top of the European investment tree in terms of source of investment, and in terms of trophy assets, I'll give you an example in a moment, and the logistics market, we're seeing record yield compression in terms of investor appetite. You're going to say something different, Neil, in a moment. And the other thing, of course, is we don't know where we are in the cycle. You guess at that. The most advanced statistical algorithms cannot tell you where we're at. Is it toppy? Are there issues? Is Brexit having an impact on them? Yes. But it's certainly not existential, far from it. Equally, we're at record low supply. In the past, when the alternative assets market has gone south, classically, we have had more buildings under development than were ever going to be required. The reverse is the case now. Debt, likewise. The banks historically have not been lending. The capital stack typically for most schemes that have been bought includes a very, very high proportion of debt. GDP, well, it's certainly not gone south. Is it stable? Couldn't say definitively. But again, the horror stories we were hearing have not come to pass. Strong demand, certainly for assets, still seems to be there. And on currency, well, as I said to someone just last week, you've now got a situation, if you're denominated in dollars, then you can buy a 10-storey building and get 2 stories free compared to what would have been the case 5 or 6 months ago. So currency is playing to our advantage. Now, how that will play through longer term, well, we'll have to see. And again, on the basis of INREV, who are the representative organisation for most of the fund managers in Europe, the UK still remains, or Europe still remains, a preferred destination with circa, I mean, we're thereabouts with France, just slightly ahead of France in terms of the allocation of investment preference. I'll just touch on London briefly before going on to the other areas of the economy. This is a snapshot or a screen grab from a piece of research done by Jones Lang LaSalle, the leading real estate advisors, who on an annual basis have what they call a momentum index, where they look at various factors, entrepreneurialism, tax regime, investor appetite and so on. London, although it's fallen in comparison with Asian cities and a number of North American cities, remains number one in Europe. So no fundamental shift in appetite amongst the investment audience. I thought I'd talk about a few deals actually. Well, until I think it's 245 Park Avenue went under the block last week, the most significant and biggest investment deals in history were done in the Square Mile, both bought by Hong Kong investors. We anticipate there's another 6 or 7 buildings will come forward. They may go to Hong Kong investors again, who are really playing the currency game very, very hard. But the beauty of this is, whatever it tells us about the market, and these are very, very pricey numbers we're looking at, the capital is being recycled. The owners of these buildings are 2 of our large REITs, British Land and Land Securities, who have not stopped developing. They're looking very closely at what they do next, but that capital will be recycled in due course into the development world. I say London is now more than just London. You'll see from that slide there that as a whole, our cities, some of our second cities, not all up there, and I've not just selectively chosen a few, I've taken a cross range from different parts of the country, in GDP growth are outperforming the average, starting to get ahead in terms of their trajectory in relation to rental growth and investment prospects. A couple of specifics now. The Northern Powerhouse was very much a product of the era when George Osborne was our Chancellor. It actually has sustained life beyond the electoral changes, now being led by Jim O'Neill, the former Goldman Sachs banker who came up with the BRICS concept you know about. And again, what we have there as a result of both HS2 and the greater devolution that's occurred in these areas is some of these cities now starting to punch significantly above the weight they historically have done. The comparison, I would suggest, is the German economy. If you look at Germany, there are 6 or 7 key cities. There's a capital, we know about Berlin, but they all exist in their own right. They all have a relevance and a distinctiveness independently of one another. And they all have significant productivity trajectories. I see, if this programme is sustained, this starting to apply throughout the United Kingdom, where people will associate Manchester and Bristol and Edinburgh and Belfast with specific areas of the economy. The BBC have relocated to just outside Manchester. Significantly, it's becoming a major media hub. Smithers Engine, another map of the UK with a railway running up it. The cities of Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton, Dudley, I could go on, are now organised and operating as one local economy. Jaguar Land Rover are based in the location. HSBC have just headquartered a major part of their business there. The way the place feels and smells and looks has changed radically in the last 2 or 3 years, and will compete, I believe, and has started to compete internationally. The last ULI survey, I think, predicted it as one of the top growing cities in the Western world. Just to illustrate that point, according to CBRE, again one of the leading real estate advisors, over the last 10 years, and it's predicted to quadruple in the forthcoming 10, approaching 50 billion of real estate investment has taken place in cities that were really off pitch until recent times. And significantly, and I've picked some of this up in terms of the conversations that were happening during the break. We enjoy, as Susan talked about, Oxford, Cambridge, UCL and other universities this morning, we enjoy some of the most significant academic institutions in the world in the United Kingdom. What has changed in recent times is that they are working far more closely, not just the science-based ones, but all the universities are working very closely with the people responsible for the economic development of their areas. Working closely to the point now that programs are in place to get people who've graduated in regional cities to remain there in terms of pursuing their career or starting their business. Now, is the impact there to any meaningful extent starting to have an impact on the housing market? But it's a trend that will grow, and it's a trend we judge appeals very significantly to the investment market. This is a bit of a technical slide, but I'll mention it. You will periodically hear, horror stories about our planning system. We've got probably the most efficient planning system in the Western world, but it's designed to protect investors. It's a system that exists to ensure that once you have deployed your capital, once you have created your asset, once the income stream is going, it's very difficult for anyone to do anything that significantly interferes with that. And then beyond that, although there are schemes where there have been significant delays, most planning applications are processed within a very short period of time. Outside China, I'm not aware of anywhere in the world where the average is as high as it is throughout the United Kingdom. Again, a screen grab. Property and real estate is all about the people that occupy it. Here's some examples of post-Brexit announcements that have had a material impact on sentiment in the United Kingdom. On which note, I'll stop preaching at you. Let Neil come up, if I may. Thank you.
Tony, thank you very much. I will quickly, let's a round of applause.